Talk, 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 talk. Art of the Zodiac presents Talk, talk, talk. Hello, I am Vivi Henriette of Art of the Zodiac here, and I am with my guest today, Chris. Is it Lyon?
It can be either or, technically. It's technically a pen name, but Lyon or Lyon, whatever works.
See, for everyone's like, wait, why don't you know this person's name? And I should say that you have a name that I'm familiar with, which I won't say out loud, and you have a pen name.
Yes.
So, but what is the preferred pronunciation of your pen name?
Generally Lyon.
Lyon.
Yeah.
So I'm with Chris Lyon of, and I say Mystai. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I've got this. I'm getting somewhere here. And do you listen to Ruin Soup? That's my first question.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I do, and I love Gordon White, and I love how he gives these really lovely intros to people. And I can't do that because I'm so afraid that I'm going to miss something. You do so many things that I'm just going to hand it over to you to introduce yourself.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Well, where do I begin with it? Yeah. So that's the thing. For people who know me, I run the Mystai Instagram account right now, and I also run the Mystai website. Mystai is essentially kind of an esoteric learning platform. I'm sort of going through like my master's degree and everything right now. So I'm going half and half between everything, but I'm mostly giving lectures on academic esotericism, historical occultism, archaeology, and all the archaeology of ancient magic, and teaching courses and just giving lectures and stuff about like historical esoterica for the most part, because that's kind of what my degree is in, or what my background is in for the most part. I ended up founding, Mystai as a platform about a year and a half ago. And then stuff ended up happening. It was a whole weird thing, the whole process of doing that. But it's only really been in the past, 3-4 months, I've actually started actively posting and actively getting out there onto, being an occultist essentially. Because I've mostly been on the background, or on the back burner because I've just been occupied with all my academic work for the most part. So I just haven't had a chance to actually go into actually making Instagram content or properly teaching, courses outside of one that I was already teaching for the past 2 years, essentially. And even that's been a relatively small cohort for the people. Basically it's been a bunch of seminars for the most part, but it's been...
I was going to say, I think you're dismissing the fact that you've been for 2 years, have had this cohort going where it's weekly lectures. I had no idea you were in grad school on top of all of this.
Yeah. I'm so I graduated from my undergrad couple of years, about 2 years ago. And I'm gearing up now, or I've been over this past year, especially it's ramped up over the past 6 months. But I'm applying. I'm moving towards doing a master's at Oxford, essentially. And that's in Egyptology. So I've been getting all of my applications sorted and getting everything kind of working in the background, because they have a bunch of other little summer school opportunities and everything as well that I've been working through and going forward for.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm not technically in grad school yet, but I will be by this time, in 6 months from now, a year from now. But I've been getting all my applications and everything sorted, and doing all the the essays and things, and preparing for the interviews, and it's all been a bit chaotic over the past 6 months, but it's been a whole thing.
Wow, I'm excited to talk to you today because you're someone who does so much, and I really just wanted to take a deep dive to learn your story. And I'm trying to piece this together because I know you graduated for your undergrad a few years ago, but you've been practicing magic for over a decade. What is your timeline? Did you take time off? Did you have a different undergrad?
No, yeah. So I got my start in Magick. Yeah, let's think, it's going on, God, it must be 12 years now, 11, 12 years, something like that. I got my start in it. A lot of my family is involved in esotericism for the most part, or they have been involved in either, or extended family have been involved in covens and things like that. So I grew up around a lot of this, especially in more kind of traditional British witchcraft, more so than anything else. But I also had a mentor from sort of very, very young. So about 11, 12, at that sort of age, I had a sort of personal mentor that I was working with in various kind of coven scenarios essentially, and he essentially sort of helped me get going, you know, and taught me a lot of the basics. And then when I eventually went to my undergrad was 4 years, so I went to undergrad when I was 18. I came immediately out of high school, went into undergrad, and that was in archaeology. So I basically just spent 4 years in archaeology on excavations, you know, doing archaeology theory, all that kind of stuff. Mostly living in London, and then obviously there is a hugely vibrant occultist scene in London where there are active temples, there are active coven meetings, there are active everything. You know, even the historical Golden Dawn was active all over London. You know, and there are still some offshoots of Golden Dawn orders. So I went through well, for the 4 years I was in uni, at least in London, I went through a lot of that kind of the rigorous, I guess we should say. I mean, we were based out of SRIA, it's like the Society of Rosicrucian in Anglia. Like their headquarters is in London, and I went through a lot of like the Golden Dawn material, working with them essentially when I was working in London, living in London, and then we just kind of gradually moved from there. And then I kind of, as I came back from London, I kind of went back into more like traditional British folk witchcraft, because that's like I came back into the countryside, and there's no covens. There's no like hardcore covens out here other than like the traditional ones. So I kind of went back into tradcraft, which is really fun, you know. And like that's kind of like my wheelhouse, kind of like my thing is kind of like I guess like if I was to try and describe my practice, it's like I have two options of it. I have my home-based stuff, which is what I grew up with, which is like traditional British folk witchcraft for the most part. And for people who don't know, when I say traditional British folk witchcraft, it's the collective term or collective name given to any of the kind of the witchcraft practices that are pre-Gardnerian Wicca. Pre-Gardnerian Wicca. So
Gardnerian?
So Gerald Gardner was the founder of Wicca, and it kind of came about in the 50s and the 60s.
Okay.
Traditional witchcraft, or traditional British folk witchcraft, is kind of the collective name for all the witchcraft practices or folk beliefs that existed prior to the founding of Wicca. Essentially, some of them got incorporated into Wicca, but it's kind of a different theology. There's a little bit of a different practice there, and that kind of thing. And a lot of it's kind of very regional and very folkloric in terms of the practice. And that's more kind of like, if I was to go down the route of calling myself like a cunning man or anything like that, that's kind of what the practice kind of stuff is on that side of things. On the other side of it, mostly from my degree, I just became obsessed because I was in archaeology and I focused on Egypt, which is also now what my master's is going to be. When I eventually go and do my master's, it's going to be in Egyptology. But I focus mostly on Egyptian magic, or like, more like Near Eastern, but specifically like Egyptian religion and magic, which naturally led me to stuff like the PGM, so the Greek magical papyri and the Demotic papyri, and then that led me into the grimoires, and then I kind of had a whole deep dive when I graduated, which was it was about 3 years ago for the most part, 3-4 years ago. But then I tried to go traveling for like a year in the middle, but then COVID happened, so that was a whole thing. So the lockdown was an annoying kind of thing. But through the lockdown, I ended up mostly working for just some like back-end YouTube companies and writing like YouTube scripts for episodes on spirituality and meditation and philosophy, all that kind of thing. Then I started with Mystai, like a little, about 2 years ago, and then I started teaching all the courses and that kind of thing. And over that whole plan and that whole situation, I just got massively into medieval magic, because especially the stuff that's like Solomonic, because it's all kind of goes back to the Demotic ritual papyri, right? The Demotic ritual manuals. So I kind of I'm not at all going to say I'm an expert in medieval magic, but I became very familiar with sort of traditional astrology and Solomonic magic and that kind of thing, and it's kind of Egyptian PGM roots essentially, and sort of working with that kind of thing. And as I was going through it, I was just kind of like, well, I mean, I'm approaching this in a kind of an academic standpoint because I'm using journals and source cited sources, things like that for it. I may as well like make some of this material available as I'm learning it and teaching it and doing it. So I kind of ended up teaching lectures and seminars and that kind of thing. And then that's kind of just how Mystai got started, and now we're growing from there. And now it's become like a weirdly larger community than I ever thought it would do. And it's like weirdly overnight as well, which is really fun.
So if I'm getting this correct, Mystai was, we're going to go way back, by the way, because I just want to sort of name that, like, you just referenced like multiple bodies of knowledge that
Hmm.
people spend their entire lives devoted to, and like you're just like, you know, going through the boxes.
Yeah.
But if I'm getting this right, Mystai was started as you expand your knowledge and get into things. You were like, okay, cool. I'm going to like share my learnings with others. And that's essentially how this platform was created.
Pretty much. Yeah. It
Yep.
was I was practicing my own magic, and I was getting into, or getting, I would say, getting a lot deeper into kind of Solomonic and medieval magic.
Yeah.
Which is its own whole huge thing in and of itself, right? And I've always kind of taken the belief that one of the things that is lacking from a lot of kind of modern practice is that kind of community practice.
Yeah.
You know, this idea of having a sense of community with people and actually being able to talk to other magicians or talk to other practitioners who are having similar experiences. I think it's something that's missing from a lot of modern occult practice. You know, even in Solomonic magic, it was surprisingly rare for the operator to actually be doing a ritual alone. They would have, you know, multiple people doing a ritual at the same time. There are, in fact, in some of the early I think in some of the early Hygromantia, which is like a Byzantine grimoire, or well, that's actually been questioned recently, but one of the ancestors of the Key of Solomon, that grimoire, one of the circles that we find in there, there's like an inscription in the, I think it's the second circle of evocation on it. There's an inscription in the Greek where, like, in the middle of the circle, the Greek basically just says, "This is where the master stands. This is where the student stands." Basically. Wow. So clearly we know that there were multiple people doing these rituals, and I think that kind of that essence is missed a lot in kind of the solo practitioner. Like the Golden Dawn and the you know, the lodge work, they kind of had a similar like idea where, like, you know, you would have a lodge of like people with different grades, and there was a sense of progression, and it was great. They didn't do it 100% correctly because the Golden Dawn fell apart. As you know, it's not 100% true, not 100% great. But either way, like I was doing this on my own, and I was like, oh, well, like this would be really cool to share with people, because I want to give people, one, the opportunity to experience this stuff, you know, actually go and do it, and actually have access to, you know, decent sources, and not just spend hours online searching for random stuff and not really getting them anywhere. So I wanted to give people a sense of structure, and also just, I guess, just give people a sense of community, like put people in touch, I guess, who were having similar experiences and doing similar rituals, and have a sense of progression of being like, oh, well, here's this week's homework, you know, quote unquote, we need to do. All of you go away and do it. Yeah. And, you know, go break off into pairs, go and do your rituals together, come back to me with feedback or like what your experiences were, and then we'll talk about them, essentially. You know, that was kind of the overarching hope that I had for the whole platform.
So, and I want to get more into that. By the way, if I ever look aside, it's because I have a Pomeranian that I'm like trying to like.
I saw him or her on the very, like, when we first joined. I was like,
yes, and I'm about to grab her because I'm scared I'm in an attic and I'm scared she's going to just jump because, you know, she's a smart dog. I don't know if she's that smart. Come here. Okay, there we go. Apologize for that detour. So, and okay, we're gonna go way back because you just kind of glossed over something. It seems like you grew up in magical community, right? So it's you are with this platform creating something for others that you yourself in a sense grew up with. Can we like go back, and I know this is a very large question, but like, what was your magical upbringing? What did that look like?
So as I said, a lot of my, I guess, my extended family, for the most part, they have been involved in covens. It was mostly traditional British witchcraft, also sort of folk regions. Most of my family, my immediate family at least, is from sort of around Kent, which is where I still am, which is sort of southeast England. So we were practicing a lot of kind of southeast. I was on the border from sort of Surrey and Kent and that kind of area. And there have been some sort of local countryside-ish covens, essentially, that have been working and meeting every now and again. But most of my original family are from like further up north, so sort of like Yorkshire and the Midlands, that kind of area. And that kind of area, especially around like Cumbria, you know, like the Lake District or anywhere like that, there are still some active covens and things up there. And they would operate, you know, whether it's extended family covens or any coven, really, they would operate in a similar kind of way, where there are, you know, maybe there's meetings at Sabbats. There would have been, you know, family things or like family get-togethers and feasts that would have had a very, I guess, ritualistic character, if I was trying to think of an adjective for it. I would go to, all that kind of thing. Some of my cousins and things, and we've exchanged information and things before. And that was definitely important. But really, a lot of my magical education and the sense of community came from my mentor, who was a guy who I met sort of through an extended family friend. Well, actually through one of my close friends. Well, yeah, it was an extended family friend, and then also a very close friend also knew of him. And they introduced me to him, and then over time, our kind of relationship just grew as the kind of sort of teacher and student, essentially. And he would invite me to a lot of his, when we eventually would, because it was also a bit more long distance. And when the times in which we could actually meet up, we would go and do a lot of rituals together. We would go and meet in some of the covens that he was involved in, and do a lot of kind of what at the time I would call sort of freeform energy work. It's not necessarily, it falls on like a very kind of weird spectrum. Like it's not necessarily strictly ritual magic, but it's also not kind of like the Reiki kind of new agey energy work kind of stuff. It's kind of energy work that is done within a ritual context, I guess you can say. So there's a lot of kind of active visualization, a lot of just moving energy around the body and moving energy towards different things. And we would meet kind of together essentially to exchange rituals. We would do rituals together, and we would meet, or I would sort of go with him to certain cover meetings or anything like that. And he had other extended friends in the magical community and all that kind of thing. And that whole practice, I guess, because that started when I was about 13, 14, I guess, like actively. Like he was training me sort of, off and on from like 11, 12, but I started actively getting involved with, I guess, his covens, some of his stuff from about sort of 13, 14.
And to interrupt you, what did that like growing up, did you have a home altar? Like, if you can give us some of the, like, without, revealing secrets, but like for people who have no clue what you're talking about, could you sort of describe what this sort of magic looked like in like the everyday life?
Yeah. Well, as a kid, it was, I'll admit, I'll say the first, I'll bust everyone's myths and perceptions right away. As a kid, it's not as fun as it sounds. As much as you might imagine. As much as people are like, oh, it must be so fun to grow up in like Hogwarts style stuff, or like magic style stuff. Like, yeah, no. Like when you're a kid and you don't, and you have that kind of sensitivity to energy, like all that kind of thing, and you're experiencing this kind of stuff, and there is also a degree of, I wouldn't say there's a degree of trauma, but in certain scenarios, when you lose people and all that kind of thing. I lost my dad as well when I was 12.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So there's been a degree of sort of trauma and things in my family as well. And I will also preface that wasn't magical related, by the way. He didn't die because he was like some ritual blew up or something. It was something else.
I know, we're talking over here like
preface, I'm not gonna, but yeah, no. So I mean, in terms of active practice. So as a kid, when you like, before I knew how to control a lot of it, and before I knew, before I had sort of the ritual framework and the worldview of sort of a magical worldview in general, I was having all these weird experiences and all these sort of weird just sensations and other things that were going on that I had no vocabulary for. So it was terrifying when I was a kid and I was growing up, because like I would have really bad night terrors, or I'd have really bad nightmares, or my house, like as cliche and sort of chic as it sounds, like my house was essentially haunted with a lot of the activity that was going on, or like I would perceive it as haunted. Now I would switch up my language and say, oh well, my house is just very active in general. Like it's not really an issue for me, because it's natural. I do a lot of ritual in it. It's natural. I'm going to get a lot of stuff coming through, and as a kid, that's not something you really know about. It's not something you kind of control or anything like that. So when you're having night terrors and all that kind of thing, it's not super fun. It's not a very healthy scenario to be in a lot of the time.
Well, it's interesting because people who maybe have sensitivities that don't grow up in the magical household might have night terrors, but then they have parents that are like, we have no idea what's going on. Did your family at least know how to like handle like what was their reaction to the things you were experiencing?
Yeah, so it's quite an interesting kind of dilemma or dynamic, because my mom, believe it or not, like she's not super into this stuff.
Okay.
So like my immediate family, and like my dad was a little bit before he passed away, so like I could talk to my dad a little bit about it more. My mom's not super into it. So like she would try and conceptualize it and sort of talk to me about it in kind of the normal kind of mundane ways, right? And that was great. And I'm actually really thankful for it, because I think growing up, it also like having that, I don't want to say materialist, because she kind of teeters on the edge between like sometimes she's materialist, sometimes you're like, oh no, there's definitely something going on, because she's had experiences as well, you know, but she kind of teeters between the two. But I think having that grounding influence was also very helpful, because it kind of kept me grounded and without going off into all these like thinking like, oh well, I'm constantly a witch from being very, very young. It's like, no, like I also had a relative, as much as I could, I had a relatively normal-ish childhood. All other things aside, you know, I still went to school, I still went to high school, all that kind of stuff. It was, you know, and I had a relatively mundane life in terms of that, but I would talk to my dad about it, and he would kind of conceptualize a lot of things for me. Or I would go and talk to my mentor or any of my extended family, and they would help me conceptualize what's going on, or give me sort of vocabulary in the very least to understand, I guess, just like things that were going on, like if there were, you know, entities or spirits or whatever in my room, or if there were certain sensations, or, you know, things like the seasonal tides, or like the zodiac tides and things like that, where, you know, the seasons come through and you can feel like when the seasonal energy gets released, and then it usually takes about 6 to 7 weeks to ground and then manifests as the actual season. So generally, when we're looking at it in traditional British lore, or traditional British folklore at least, seasonal tides, or sort of the energy that, like, I guess there's not really a good word for it. I call it seasonal tides, but that's at least what we call it here as well. It's the energy that eventually manifests as the seasons, right? So as we go through the year, we have sort of seasonal living and seasonal things, right? And the energy that does that is released generally on the solstice and the equinox, whatever one is the next season that comes across, right? So the winter, the spring tide, for example, what that eventually becomes the season of spring, is released on the winter solstice, right? 21st of December. That energy gets released. Then 6-7 weeks later, it takes 6-7 weeks to ground. So it's around February, March. Then spring comes in, right? And then that manifests as the season of spring. Then the next cycle gets released, right, on the vernal equinox, which is the spring equinox, right? That then releases the summer tide. So then 6-7 weeks later, it gets to around June, July, that kind of thing, or May, like late May, June. Then the summer is released. Summer gets grounded, and we get summer, right? And then the whole thing, and then the final one, the winter, the harvest tide is released on the summer solstice, and then the winter tide is released on the autumn equinox, and that manifests as where we are now, essentially, right? So the winter tide just got released a little while ago, and having that kind of vocabulary, or that conception, it helped me understand how I was reacting to a lot of the seasonal changes, you know, or a lot of the, if I felt, you know, the different kinds of spirits in the land at different kinds of times, or different transits and things going on astrologically that I didn't understand, and how, if they were affecting me, or if I could see, you know, things happening at planetary hours or anything like that would affect things, I had a better vocabulary to be able to kind of unpack that, essentially, because I grew up in that kind of scenario. And obviously now that I've gone through kind of the more, I guess you can say, like hardcore academic sources, or like the hardcore like actual things, I actually have citations to back up from historically what I worked with and practiced for a long time before I knew, you know, before I had citations for it. So they kind of blended together.
I had no clue that, to go back to that for a moment, this sort of seasonal tides concept, which I could imagine like being jarring, because they don't really line up, right? So we just entered the season of fall, the winter tide was released, and so you're saying like you had noticed a shift in like the energy, or like how is this appearing to you? Like what were you experiencing?
Well, it's a mix of things. So there's a difference between when a tide gets released and when it grounds.
Okay.
So, for example, the winter tide, the winter tide may have just been released on the autumn equinox, right? So September 21st, and it will take about 6, 7, 8 weeks or so to actually ground and become winter proper, which is around sort of Halloween, essentially, or Samhain in the old calendar, right? So we won't experience kind of winter proper until around that kind of time, you know. But we're going to start seeing the effects of winter start to come through now. So like even here, as we're getting into October now, you know, we're starting to see some of the first frost on the ground, you know. And this is like, it's one of the things that I learned from, I guess, from a tradcraft background, but it applies to everything. Of you just always want to kind of look for your signs in nature.
Okay.
Nature is always going to give you all of your signs anyway, you know. And it's one of those things where, you know, the feasts or the commemorations or the sabbats, whatever you want to call them, whatever you want to do, they are always going to be kind of celebrated at different times and different places. You know, I'm not a big fan of, as much as I like the astrology, I'm not a big fan of like things happening on specific dates. Like it's a very popular thing in kind of the neo-pagan calendar where people say, oh well, Samhain is definitely October 31st, or you know, Mabon or whatever is September 1st, or August 1st, whatever it is. Candlemas or Rude Mass or whatever it is, La Mass, everything. You know, all the different like neo-pagan holidays, and people think that they're tied to like an actual calendar, that they happen exactly on one day. It's like, no, that's not how it works. At least it's how it works in traditional witchcraft. You know, that might be how it works in Wicca, but that's not how it works in traditional witchcraft, because for traditional witchcraft, you wait until you have kind of or you receive some kind of sign, right? Or you have some kind of inclination that the energy is moving there. So whether you see, like, I don't know, like a good example for the harvest tide that's just gone, for example, is animals start storing up for winter.
Okay.
You know, so hibernation starts happening, or they start foraging for food, or certain animals come out, or certain animals go away. So like the defining element for like autumn, or the autumn tide and the winter tide, is the birds that came during the spring and the summer are now kind of flying back, and they're dismantling their nests and they're going away. So you kind of just look at the landscape, look at how the animals behaving, look at all this kind of thing to, I guess, just see the way the land is moving and the way the land's responding to whatever energy's coming through. So it's an interesting kind of interplay that you have a much deeper relationship with the land. I think that's the thing. Whereas if you're working astrologically, you have a bigger relationship with the stars or the luminaries, whatever it is. In a way, I kind of like to take the approach of like how people describe geomancy, almost, because people describe geomancy as like the sister of astrology.
Okay.
You know, it's like,
what is geomancy again?
Sort of throwing. It's throwing of lots, right? And like each lot kind of has a specific astrological association or whatever it is. It's a form of divination, essentially.
Okay.
But it's often described, I think even Agrippa describes it as the sister, like basically the sister of astrology. You know, and like the way it's kind of conceptualized in modern circles is like astrology is like what's going on up there, and geomancy tells you like what's going on down here. You know, it's kind of like that interplay. And it's like I have the same kind of view with the seasons and the landscape as well, where it's like you look up, it's like astrology tells you what's going on up there, and that's kind of where things start. Because I'm also like quite heavily like Platonic and Neoplatonic, so like everything kind of starts up there in like the noetic kind of spiritual realm, and then down here, by looking at the landscape and looking at the way everything is moving, then you can see how those energies and those effects or those inspirations are being grounded into nature, which is actually where you live. You know, it's like actually what's going on down here. So I don't know, I use astrology a lot for prediction, which is more along the lines of traditional astrology. If I'm doing anything in terms of like just general life advice or like day-to-day divination, I will use much more landscape-based divinations.
So I want to go back to this before we get too far off. So, but you mentioned, so growing up, you had this household where it's like you knew you had this sort of lineage of, you know, your extended family were in covens, so there was like magic all around you. Your father was into it. Your mother was a little more, right? So like grounded. At an early age, you start having these experiences, night terrors, nightmares. You mentioned that you started kind of feeling the shift of the tides and having some sort of experiences about the different entities coming through, but you were able to talk to your family to like suss that out and figure out what was going on. But when it comes to, and this is what I'm curious about, like when it comes to the you mentioned like feeling the shift of the seasons and having some experiences and not understanding like what was going on. What were you experiencing? And how was it jarring to you?
Yeah, so I guess like you could conceptualize it in like modern terminology. It's almost like seasonal affective disorder.
Okay.
You know, so like that. That's kind of a way I would conceptualize it in a kind of way. Like it was most pronounced at like the changing from spring or summer to winter.
Okay.
You know, it's like you can like I would feel myself getting intrinsically just like my outlook on the world will be much more pessimistic. It would be much more darker. Generally, visionary experiences and like visitations or anything like that would also increase in the winter as well. Like I didn't have as many kind of night terrors or anything like that during summer months or spring months. It was much more relatively calm. Or if I did, they would be just like of a different character. they would be much more kind of fluid and like growth orientated.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, when we move into winter, like the kind of dreams and the night terrors and just general experiences and things like that, they'll be much more pronounced in themes of death, like, you know, resolution, decay, the winter theme, like ancestral themes, right? Death isn't necessarily negative, it's just like of the other world of some kind, right? Like spiritual themes that are transcendent, more or less. But I know, like as an example, I'd often things would often like transcend dreams as well. So I might begin having a dream, but then I would wake up and like the dream would continue, or there would be some kind of apparition or some kind of sensation appear in my room. Or if I was left home alone during the day, there would be, you know, think of your classic haunted house stuff. There would be footsteps running, there would be things moving in the kitchen, that kind of thing. And that would always increase in winter. But it increased generally the more I paid attention to it, you know, which is kind of typical from what I've heard from most people. Like the more attention you give it, the more energy you give it, the more it kind of comes alive, essentially. But yeah, I did have, to refer back to another question you had, I did have a kind of a working altar growing up, in at least in my bedroom. And that was, I had that even from when I started with my mentor, essentially, because he always made it a very big thing of being like, no, like the altar is kind of like the hearth room of whatever space it's in, or it's the hearth of whatever space it's in, right? So the hearth is like the center of the household, and traditionally it's where a lot of the magic is performed. You know, like a lot of the traditional folk witches, they will do their magic around the hearth, mostly because there was a belief across a lot of the UK in general, but like especially in places like Cornwall in the south, but I think it's probably the same up north as well, that a lot of magic or a lot of spirits and things, they come up and down the chimney. You know, the chimney is like it's a place of sending forth or entering, usually. So that's kind of why the hearth is so important as well. Like everyone gathers around the hearth, and it's also where you can send the intentions of the household out, or something can come in. So that's why there are also a lot of protections that we usually place around the hearth. And also in, you know, when we, if I speak from the archaeology side, if we go back to, you know, Celtic roundhouses and things that we found around here in the south, it's a fairly common thing. Even in this kind of persisted into, you know, the early modern period as well. But ancestors used to be buried under the hearth as well. So people would meet around the hearth, the living, but then also they would also, when somebody died, they would bury the person under the hearth as well, so that the person could continue to meet around the hearth, or their spirit could meet around the hearth.
Were these more, when you're talking about archaeology, were these more like places where people like co-lived? So the hearth would be like a communal space. It wouldn't necessarily be in your home.
It could be both.
Okay.
So there could have been, it depends on the society and hugely, but if you look at something like a typical Iron Age Celtic roundhouse, for example, then they would have had a central hearth within the home, or like you would have like different roundhouses and stuff inside like a village community, and there may have been like one giant fire in the middle, which, you know, maybe was reserved for, you know, chiefs or elders or whatever it was. But each house had a hearth as well, and people, like, we do have a fair amount of people who were buried either under the doorway or under the hearth of the actual home.
Oh, wow. I had no clue.
It depends either or. And the doorway makes sense because the doorway is liminal, right? So it's a space between this world and the next. But the hearth also makes sense because it's the place everyone gathers around. So you bury your ancestors under the hearth, and it's a way to continue to connect with them and have a practice with them. And we have, again, other similar practices from the Near East. This isn't just a British thing as well. Like the Egyptians, the Sumerians, everyone does it. Like they let you bury the ancestors under the floorboards. Essentially, it's kind of like a weirdly like Edgar Allan Poe Telltale Heart kind of scenario. But you know, when you mentioned having this working altar in your bedroom, I think it was you just recently interviewed him too, Eric Perdue, translator of Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. I think it was a conversation with him, and he was saying, I think it's a Santeria tradition, or, you know, just sort of maybe general guidance of that. Maybe it's not recommended to have an altar in your bedroom, because you kind of want to keep your sleeping place separate from the spirits. And so I'm wondering if, like, you know, as a really sensitive child in a haunted house, and your altar in your bedroom, did it, like, was that maybe part of the chaos? Like, you were just like Yeah,
extra
I don't
exposure?
doubt it. My altar now is like across the hall. It's very far from my bedroom now. I have learned the lesson. I don't do that anymore. I never do because of my bed. Oh, well, like no, I think technically that's a lie. I do like dream incubation in my
Okay.
bedroom still, but that's only because I sleep there. You know,
What
like
is
if I was
what
sleep,
is dream incubation? Sorry, we're gonna have to detour here.
so essentially kind of triggering lucid dreams or triggering dreaming with entities essentially. So it's a very popular kind of a form of magic in ancient Greek tradition, especially Greek necromancy,
Okay.
um, where people in ancient Greece, they would go to these things called necromantions, which are basically like dead oracles. They're like places where it was believed that the border between Hades and here were very thin.
Okay.
And you would go to kind of consult the dead with an oracle in the same way that someone would go to the Oracle of Delphi, you know, the
Yeah.
Pythia of Delphi to determine the course of a battle or whatever it was. They also had other oracle spots, essentially, a fair amount of which were chthonic, which is underworld based or under the earth. And these necromantions, they were specifically oracles for the dead. One of the most famous ones is in what's called Archeology, which is it's near, it's like in it's like I think it's like in near Italy. I can't remember exactly where it is. But I'll have to check it. But there were like 4 or 5 like big prominent necromantic little dead oracles across Greece.
Yeah.
Odysseus in the Odyssey also goes and uses one. I think it's like book 10, something like that, when he goes into the underworld to go and find Tiresias, the prophet. He goes to one of the necromantions to do it.
Oh, okay.
But they're doing this whole thing, but the way they actually worked in terms of the actual practice, in terms of the actual like experience, the way they worked is you would go to the necromantion, the priests there, or the facilitators, they would facilitate the experience usually. In some scenarios, you would go into a cave, so you would walk into the cave and like you would go down the cave, so it's kind of this katabasis, which is like the descent into the underworld. Or much more commonly, or much more popularly, I should say, generally what would happen is you would probably sacrifice like a ram, something like that, usually a black ram, because that's kind of underworld. And there are specific ways of doing that. Usually you have to make the animal's head point towards the underworld if it's an offering to the underworld's god. If it's a sky, if you're offering to Zeus, for example, you make it look up to the sky before you kill it and that kind of thing. There's a whole etiquette in terms of the ritual. It's very strange. But you would sacrifice the ram, then you would usually probably like shear it and get its coat, and then you would sort of lay the coat down, and then you would go to sleep on the coat of the ram that you sacrificed inside the necromantion, and then the god that you call, or the deity, or the dead oracle, the dead person you're looking for, will come into your dreams and will tell you what you want to know, essentially. And we find the same idea, and it's building off of this idea that we find in Homer, who obviously is the author of the Iliad and Odyssey. The way he uses like his language around dreams is very different to ours. So when we say we have a dream, we like use like we say that the like dream is like the object, you know, like we use like as kind of objectively. We say we have a dream. Like when you're in like normal conversation, you're like, oh yeah, I had a dream last night, you know. So it's a thing that is kind of like it stands on its own, you know. For Homer, dreams were more of a consequence of a visitation, right? You didn't have dreams; you were visited by a dream. That's like the adjective that he like. That's the way he describes it. It's like when you look at like Achilles or Patroclus' dreams and stuff in the Iliad, the way it's described, when they wake up, they're talking to each other and they say, "Oh yeah, I was visited by a dream last night." You know, that's the way he explains it. So it's very, very different. And Pythagoras talks about the same thing, where there's this like old story of Pythagoras where a man sort of comes to him and he goes, oh, well, you know, my father died 5 years ago, but last night I had a dream about him and he told me this. Like Pythagoras is reported as like being very, very firm, being like, yeah, your father was in the dream. Like your father came and visited you. Like there's no sense of, oh, well, this is just a dream. You know, like Pythagoras is very convinced, like, oh no, like your father 100%, like the spirit or the soul of your father came back from Hades and visited you, and that's what caused the dream. And the way Homer kind of explains it is like the spirit or the entity that causes the dream will kind of come into the house or come into the room and kind of stand at either your head or the foot of the bed, usually, and kind of like put their hands over your head, like kind of like that or something, and that's what causes the dream, essentially. Right, and it's kind of the same. We have the same thing in like Germanic tradition and pagan, you know, German traditions or German folklore, where we have this creature called the mare, right? Which is where we get the modern English word nightmare. It comes from German. A nightmare is a kind of fairy or a kind of like hobgoblin kind of thing in Germanic folklore. And the basic idea is that when you go to sleep, like this little sprite, this little fairy, whatever it is, comes and jumps on your chest and like starts playing around and like pulling your hair and things in your sleep. And that's what causes nightmares. That's where we get the word from. So you're like, when we use the word nightmare or night terror or anything like that, it's referring to a spirit usually that will come and like cause the terror, or it will cause, like, the nightmare is a mare of the night, and that's what it is. And a mare is a kind of spirit that causes dreams, and usually bad dreams.
Which is a little sprite-like creature. I love that.
Yeah, it's like a little like gnome or a little dwarf, whatever it is. Yeah, like Germanic folklore is filled with all these like weird little fairy type things, like kobolds, hobgoblins, whatever it is. So they're all over the place, but they cause bad dreams and all that kind of thing. They're also weird. I think in Iceland and like parts of Scandinavia, they have other weird ones. There's like there's a hairstyle called elf locks. I don't know if you heard of it.
No.
Where like it's like a certain kind of way where like you'd like twist and braid your hair, right? Like elf braids or whatever it is. And the folklore behind it is like in, you know, Viking age Scandinavia or whatever it was, little girls would go to bed and they would wake up with their hair like styled in this way. And if they did, then they would say, oh no, well the elves came in the night and like styled your hair and pulled your hair, and now it's turned up in these like specific looking braids that are called elf locks. And the reason they are is because elves styled them. That's the belief. Right? It was the folklore.
That's amazing. I want to, so it's, we've just come full circle. So here you are, young child, right? Growing up in this haunted, what you would then call haunted, you would now say is just a very active house.
Yeah.
Your first, maybe some of your first experiences, uncomfortably so, are having these like nightmares, night terrors. You sort of eventually, one of the ways you learn to work with this is through the altar. You know, and we've come full circle now that you have the altar in a different room, but you've learned to sort of work with your dreams and these entities in a sense. So now you can do this. I want to go like those first earliest experiences, right? Did you ever find out what was active in your house? Were these ancestors? Did you learn to work with them? Like, tell me a little bit more of like what happened when you first set out the altar. Were there some experiences around that too?
Yeah, well, so the altar, part of the reason, well, the way that my mentor explained to me, like when I was setting up the altar, was that the altar was kind of a way to centralize the activity, essentially. So like when you don't have an altar, or you don't have even like, and again, I'm using the term altar very kind of liberally. Like you could equally also just have like a centralized or focused place for practice. Like a countertop could be your altar, as long as you intentionally make it like a focused space, you know. The intention of it is that you you demarcate out a space where you're like, this space specifically is for ritual. And the reason you do that is because, or at least in my case, and this isn't what like it worked for me when I was younger, is, you know, the activity or the energy, whatever it is like all over the place. It's happening in different rooms, it's happening everywhere, until I made the altar. And then when I made the altar, it gave all of that activity a space to kind of funnel through and channel through, where a lot of my activity was then centered around the altar, because the altar became the dedicated space for working with spirits. You know, it doesn't mean that like other stuff didn't happen. Like even when I still had the altar, I would still have, you know, weird night experiences, or like I would still hear footsteps running up and down the stairs, or whatever it is, or I'd still hear doors shut and slam downstairs, all that kind of thing. So it still happened, but it decreased in other rooms of the house and focused a lot more around the altar. And that's even the same of me today, right? It's very rare now, even though I say my house is active, I think I should probably rephrase, my altar room is very active. The rest of my house is generally fine. I don't have too many issues, because my altar room is like warded to shit. It's got sigils all over the place that keep whatever is in there in and doesn't let it out, essentially. So it's fine. But I've had weird experiences in the altar room as well. I know this is like kind of looping back. I'll go back to my the childhood one in a minute. But one experience that even today still happens. I got this thing. This was about a year ago. I actually came into possession of this. I have, again, not related, but I have a family friend who is I guess we can say traditional cunning man in Essex. He lives in Essex, essentially. And Essex, for those of you who are listening, is part of the witch country. It's very famous for witch trials. It's kind of, well, it's part of Essex, Suffolk, and Norfolk, which are called the witch country. They are kind of like massively famous for witchcraft in England. He's a traditional cunning man in Essex, essentially. And he called me up a little bit sort of last year to say that there was a local church where he was kind of working at or around. There was like a poltergeist, or there was some kind of spirit in the graveyard that was very aggressive and was, you know, hurt, not necessarily hurting people, but doing it like scratching, pulling, pushing, all that kind of stuff. And he sort of called me up. He's like, yeah, this like I did my whole thing, and I basically just bound the spirit in a jar. Like I have like a spirit jar essentially. So we sealed the spirit inside jars to stop, or he did it to stop it from kind of expanding and doing this weird stuff. And he's like, yeah, I kind of have a problem where like I already have like 3 of these things. Like, do you want it? And I was like, huh, yeah, right, yeah, right, yeah, okay, sure, I'll go with that, whatever. So he sent it to me. And it got there for the next couple of days, and now I still have it. It is I have like some interesting, funny nicknames for it. My mum always loves to call it Casper just because she's funny. But it's a whole thing. We have like it's in my altar, because my altar is kind of like it's like a cabinet. And it has like 2 little like pull drawers when like you can go inside it, that kind of thing. So it's just kind of sitting like in the cupboard of my altar, but it's like it's about this high. It's a spirit jar. You know, it has a spirit that was bound inside of it. And there are various methods and ways of binding spirits in jars, and that kind of thing is very established in cunning folk tradition. But I've had it has been quite a common occurrence, I should say, of that jar will move by itself quite often.
I just don't want to imagine like a sticker on it that's like XXX and
do
like
not touch.
do not touch. And of course, like someone like comes to like, you know, clean the house. Like it feels very like Pandora's box to me.
Yeah, well, the other thing, like I've made it very clear to everyone in my house of like, you do not clean my altar room. Like I am the only one that cleans my altar room. Like no one goes in there but me. Like if you go in there, like there's going to be problems. There's going to be an issue, you know. And so far has been a problem, because like the other thing that my friend told me, and this is a fairly established thing. As far as I can tell, it's found in multiple folk traditions. So as far as I'm concerned, it would be established. Around the south and sort of Midlands of England, when you're dealing with mainly as far as I can tell, this thing is a Saturnian spirit, right? Okay. So it's ruled by Saturn, and when you're dealing with Saturnian spirits like that, especially ones that are bound in jars like that, you should not expose them to sunlight, like because the sun and Saturn have kind of an astrological feud going on at times. Yeah. Saturnian spirits like that, you call on them at night, and you don't expose the jar to sunlight. And if it does, it kind of breaks the jar, or it kind of does weird things to the jar and makes it less effective, or that kind of thing. So that's kind of why I keep it in my altar cupboard. I don't let it out. I just put it on the windowsill, whatever it is, because if the sunlight catches it, it will damage the jar, will make it could like upset the spirit or some kind of thing. So I make sure it's kind of locked away essentially, unless it's a night where I take it out and you've touched on something here. So it's not just that like you have the spirit jar because someone needs to have this for safekeeping. It feels like there's a way to work with the spirit jar. That's the part I want to know about. Yeah, absolutely.
Tell me that.
Yeah. So the way I would consider, like, I'm hesitant to call it a familiar at this point, because it's still kind of like it's far too temperamental to be a familiar. You know, it's far too. I'm not gonna say it's aggressive, but it kind of, I don't know. Let me put it this way: the visualizations and the visionary experiences I have when I work with it, almost unanimously every single time, it's always like ivy that comes up. So like if you imagine like the plant ivy, like the spiraling, that kind of thing, it's always like the image that comes to me whenever I work with it is always like ivy that spirals around and like constricts stuff. That's kind of the way it always comes through. And I don't know if that's just because like ivy is associated with it, or it's like the spirit was like living in an ivy bush or something before it was captured. I have no idea. But like it's one of those, like I treat it more like at this point as just it's like a massive clump of like energy that can do stuff, and I just kind of point it in a direction and it goes and does stuff. It's not really a working relationship as much as I can say, because like the thing is just like a bundle of like teenage angst, essentially. It's like how I would describe it. It's like very aggressive, very kind of angry a lot of the time. So I'm kind of just like, okay, if I need something done, I need something like a lot of extra energy given to something, I'll just point this thing in a certain direction and say, okay, like here's what we're going to do. I'll still give it offerings. Usually what I'll do with it is I'll get the jar out. If we're talking pure practice here, I'll get the jar out, set up the candles. I'll do my opening rituals, whether it's LBRP, whether it's the Picatrix stuff, like the Picatrix prayers, anything like that. And anything else I do. I am quite fond of like the system that all Jake Stratton Kent's like edits on the Liber Pyramidos, so Crowley's Liber Pyramidos. He like has a whole opening system that he kind of flips around to work less solomonically. So if you're not like comfortable with doing Abrahamic stuff or anything like that, he flips it around to focus on like combining the alchemical triad, so Mercury, Sulfur, and Salt, with like Hecate, Hermes, and Hades, essentially. And he you call different directions to make this kind of like square or not square, like a triangle circle rather than a magic circle. It's very interesting. I've experimented with that, so I'll do opening things. I'll have the jars on my altar. Generally, I will give it an offering of fresh water, so spring water, and usually also fresh fruits, and then also I will go and cut like fresh flowers, probably from my garden, because I have like a bunch of like as a practicing witch, I have a massive bunch of herb beds in my garden, which are great, which I think everyone should have, even if it's just for cooking. But I go and cut some fresh herbs or some fresh flowers and offer them. So it's spring water, flowers, and fresh fruits, or like nuts or something like that, as an offering, and that kind of calms it down a little bit and lets me kind of say, okay, this is what we're going to do today. Like, now that put your energy this kind of way, go and do this kind of thing. But I don't, there's no like hardcore like line of saying, okay, like this is why it obeys you, this is why it does stuff. I'm kind of just working on the assumption of like it's bored, like it can't get out of the jar, because it's bound and sealed inside the jar, which honestly, rightfully so. It's a bit of an aggressive spirit. So it can still get out and go and do stuff. Like it can still go to places, kind of like a fetch body.
Yeah.
But it's always has to return to the jar, right? It's always bound back to the jar. So like it kind of does that. So I'm just kind of working under the assumption that it's doing it out of boredom. Like it's got nothing else to do, so it may as well just go and do some fun stuff when I let it out.
Can you give me an example? Like I want to know, like just a mundane example of what it might do for you. Like what kind of practical thing?
It can do anything. So like you can do like any ritual that you're working with. If it's any kind of malefica, actually, because it's an aggressive spirit, it specializes in malefica. So any kind of cursing or anything like that, it's very good for that kind of stuff. Not that I'm advocating for that, but it's very. I found it can be very good for that kind of thing. But
oh my god, is it like your spirit hitman? You're like go in
a kind of way. It's like an unnamed kind of weird spirit hitman that I can use. It's like I don't actively practice Malefica. I mean, when I was a teenager, I went through my series of teenage angsts. I think all of us do, where I was like maybe throwing a few curses around because I was very immature. But that's not how I like anymore. I've matured and aged into much more mellow now. But it's a whole thing. But like it's very good for that. But any kind of, if you can think of any kind of ritual that would otherwise involve a spirit, so anything you would call on a grimoire spirit for, anything that you may, call on an astrological, or make an astrological talisman for, so whether it's acquiring wealth, acquiring prosperity, acquiring love, typical goals of magic, you can task. I can task the spirit to do the same thing. It's a spirit. You can do the same kind of thing that you would do with a grimoire spirit. Like flick through the grimoires, that kind of thing. I generally use it quite like the at least recently, the past few months. Ironically, since I started getting more like popular online, one of the consequences that happens when you get a bit known online is you start kind of pissing people off, and then people start throwing curses at you every now and again. So it's kind of a whole thing. But I've set it up quite, or at least for the past 6 months, it's been a very good kind of stalwart defender of my home in general. So it's kind of like a protective spirit at this point. I usually just task it to attack any like extra entities that come in that are hostile, or protect me from other things in general. So it's a very good protector spirit. And it's there's a whole thing with that. But yeah, I'm mostly using it for like protective workings right now, or like counter curses or anything like that. Yeah. That's kind of how I'm using it at the moment. But it is quite finicky sometimes, because like I said a while ago, that the jar does move by itself. Well, like most of the time it is like in my altar cupboard, and like it stays in the altar cupboard. But I have had 3 or 4 times where I like gone to check my altar cupboard, or I've gone to do a working with it and it's not in there. I'm like, but then like we have this whole like ensuring game that happens where I have to like go around my entire house, like opening all the cupboards, trying to find where it is. And it's a whole thing. Like the two weirdest ones, or the ones that kind of, or the one that freaked me out the most is I found it like basically like on I have a desk in my bedroom as well. And I found it had moved to the desk on my bedroom as well, like by itself, as far as I'm aware. Like, because there was no one else in the house at this point.
Yeah.
You know, like they were like my parents, whatever, they were out of the house, and that was it. You know, so like this thing moved by itself, like seemingly. You know, I'm looking at my hallway, like across the hallway and like through my bedroom door onto the table in my bedroom. So like, sure, okay. And then the furthest it's moved is I found it downstairs in the kitchen cupboards or on the kitchen countertop as well. And like that's the weirdest one for me because like it has to not only get through like my altar cupboard, but it has to get downstairs and then into the kitchen and then into a kitchen cupboard. I'm like, I have no fucking idea how we got there. But this thing just naturally moves a lot. So like it moves by itself. So I'm just kind of like, eh. Like there's nothing I can really do about it. I just kind of go and put it back, and it's like, yeah, okay. Generally, like if it starts moving a lot, I will generally just give it like an extra plate of offerings just to kind of playsate it usually. But yeah, it's a whole relationship you have to build with these things, you know. But it's a thing. You can make spirit jars, and I suppose you can make astrological spirit jars as well. You know, like it's the same kind of thing. You just invoke a planetary spirit into the jar rather than binding a natural land spirit or whatever it is. Because as far as I'm aware, it's a Saturnian spirit, but I think it's also like a local land spirit there as well, like or where it was. Like it's kind of like a mix of both, I think. And this kind of conceptualizes, it feeds into how I conceptualize spirits a little bit. Like I'm still fairly like standard on the grimoire practice, so I conceptualize a lot of spirits through the planetary spheres. So I'm like, okay, well, this is a Saturnian spirit, this is a jovial spirit, this is a mercurial spirit, whatever it is. But I'm also kind of, I bring it into like tradcraft stuff. So even like land spirits, I will still say are Saturnian or whatever, or not all down to, but like certain spirits will have different planetary associations depending on behaviors and characteristics, all that kind of thing. You know,
I love how this has been one of the most delightful talks I've had. And I like how we started with just like, what's your practice, to like sort of opening up this box of this literal haunted house. And we now come full circle with this spirit hitman that you keep in your altar, which I feel like I want to have, as we're sort of wrapping up on our hour, I want to have like another episode with you where we, you know, the thing we'd even get into is I want to ask you more about like the history of witchcraft in England and Wicca and all. There's so many sort of different ways that I want to go, but alas, time is restricted here. Can we come to the present moment right now? So just sort of like people who are, I mean, you dropped a lot of references. I didn't want to sort of stop you. There's moments where I was like, your brain is doing this. So
yeah, it's the whole thing. It's a standard procedure for my brain. Yeah.
No, it's brilliant. But I guess what I'm saying is, can people study with you? Like if people want to like dive in to like, just like learn more with you, can you tell me a little bit more about what you have what your offerings are?
Yeah. So I'm currently running a Discord server. That's kind of where my main home base is at. So like, that's free, so everyone can join that. But if you want to, like, I'm teaching, like, if you want to learn actively learn stuff. So I'm still teaching my live course. So that's ending in like the next couple of months, but it's still going. So you can still like get on board and sign up for that kind of thing. All the pre-recorded stuff over the past 2 years is recorded, so you can go through that and watch it. Other than that, we meet every single Wednesday, or we meet twice a week. So we meet on Tuesdays to go through like a smaller seminar group to go through texts. Essentially, it's like we'll have like some kind of like spiritual text, whatever it is. We'll go through it. Then on Wednesdays we did the main lectures, and all that can be found on my website, which is mystai.co.uk. And you can find that kind of thing. That's there. But like I said, that's ending in like the next couple of months. And then after that, I'm moving into a Hermetica course. So I'm basically taking all of what is going to eventually be my master's thesis research on Hermetica and Egyptian magic, essentially, and turning it into a course to make all of that Hermetica scholarship available for people, essentially, at a hopefully much less than like Brill academic textbooks. Because if you go on Brill, it's like $200 for a single book. I'm like, okay, that's not going to work for people, you know. So I'm like, I want to try and make this a bit more accessible for people there, so they have access to scholarship. But if you're interested in like Egyptian stuff and Hermetica, then that's the next course that you can sign up for that we'll be going through, and that's lectures as usual. But that's kind of that's the two ways I usually work. So I'll usually give like a 2-hour lecture on a Wednesday, and then like an hour and a half like seminar study group where we like go through some papyri or some grimoire or whatever, and like pick things out for ritual practice or whatever. And then we have Discord doing stuff as well. But yeah, that's kind of it. And then in the next couple months, I'm not sure how this is going to work. I mean, we had talked about this before. In the next couple months, I don't have a definitive time frame yet. But we are like I partner with a couple of other like coaches and friends, some people who are into shamanism, some people who are into like professional development and entrepreneurship and that kind of thing. And we are building an app as well for not just occultism. I'm gonna say like spirituality in general, but like a lot of the courses and stuff on there will also have an occult flavor to them. So if you're interested in occultism, there is a place for you. But we are like building an app and stuff at the moment that is going to include a lot of stuff for the most part. It's going to have like most of the courses and stuff on there that I've taught in the past, or other authors and things I've taught in the past. It's going to have a way to track like your meditations and your meditation time and that kind of thing. It'll have like private feeds like Facebook and Instagram, so like a usual kind of like, you know, same way that you post pictures and videos of your cat or whatever on Instagram, you can do that here. Although maybe like, you know, more witchy stuff, hopefully. But that's not like I have no idea what people are going to post. That's the whole thing. But then you have access to the courses, and then I have debated doing this every now and again. But I did recently open up like one-on-one spots as well, like for like one-on-one tutoring or like one-on-one coaching, things like that. And I think when we launch the app, I think what we'll also do is we'll have like a group coaching as well. So like, as well as the courses and things like that. I want to talk to some of my friends and things like that, see if we can get them on to, because they're also coaches, to see if we can do like in-person group coaching calls essentially once a week, you know, and like we can have like exercises, or like people can bring whatever issues and then like bespoke things that they're struggling with, and then we can help you with it and that kind of thing. And at the same time, because it's an app, we can do push notifications and things as well. So in my mind, what I am hoping for in the end is to be able to like do like an astrology chart for the week or like for the month or whatever it is, and find like specific good times for talismans or good times, whatever it is, and then like schedule push notifications the day before. So like you can like on your phone, like you can literally pick it up and you'll get like a text or whatever it is on your phone being like, hey, tomorrow is a really good time for a sun talisman between this hour and this hour. Here's like some ritual practice you can do. And then because it's an app, like we have like a whole library of courses and things in there with like materials and PDFs and things like that. So I can have like, you know, in theory, I could have descriptions of all the talismans from Agrippa or Picatrix, or like images of talismans and like lists of materials and things like that, being like, okay, like here's something really good for Jupiter. Here's an image of Jupiter. And then when you get a notification or a text, you'll get a link inside the app that then takes you to like all of the pages and things like that that tell you like how to make the talisman and like materials and all that kind of thing. Like that's the end goal hope. I have no idea like how feasible that's going to be to actually like code into it or like actually do. But I'm like, that's kind of where I want to go with it, where it's like, I want to, like, and again, this is like, I don't want to get to this like right now because like we're nearing the end. But it's like, I want to, like, magic should be accessible to people. Like, and especially with like all the like with the weird stuff that's come out of the past few days when I released the Hermetica course, like the amount of people who came in and were like gatekeeping stuff, and they're like, no, you can't teach this. It's sacred. I'm like, yes, it's sacred. You need to be respectful, but like magic should be accessible to make people's lives better. You know, like you want to be able to pursue the great work, whatever it is for you. It's like you need to like actually be able to do practical magic with that. It's like I want to make that accessible to people. And let's face it, like the main way of accessibility is on your phone right now. You know, everyone's on their phone 24/7. You know, it's like you may as well. I want to make people's phone experiences occult and magical, essentially. Or I want to have that option for them.
So the best way to the app is coming soon, but right now you have a course that's ending, but people can still sign up, a few months left for that.
Yep.
And then you have the Hermetic course, Hermeticism course that's starting in the January, right?
Probably around January. So like it'll start basically within a month of whenever I finish this current course.
Okay.
So like the current course is still going, and like even if you sign up now, you'll still get access to all the past 2 years of lectures and recordings from everything I've done.
Yeah.
And then even then, when this current course is like done, I'm still just gonna package it as it's standalone, so you can just buy the recordings as well. Like it's like you can still get all the material. That's fine. But as soon as it's finished, I'll have like maybe a month's break to get everything prepared, and then I'll launch Hermetica essentially. So I'm anticipating finishing by the end of the year, essentially. So like by December, I'll probably finish with this one, and then that's why I say January, but it could be like February or something like that. I'm not sure. Depends how long this course goes for, because we're finishing up thought forms now. So we just had a whole month and a half of making thought forms and egregores and servitors, that kind of thing. Then next month, which is kind of like the final module, we're like going to be diving into like dream incubation and astral projection and all that kind of stuff, and doing the live lectures and courses on that. So everything I talked about today about the dream incubation and that kind of thing, so I'll be teaching that essentially, although I won't be sacrificing any rams, just preface. I'll teach you how to do it without doing that, hopefully. But that's what I'll do for this month or until the end of the year. Essentially that'll ties up, and then I'll start the Hermetica stuff.
So the best way for people to find you is mystai.co.uk.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So, and then I will write you after this. Actually, I'm gonna say goodbye to you and officially end this recording before I start talking about what comes after. So thank you so much, Chris Lyon. Got it right this time?
There you go.
For joining me. This has been fabulous.
Brilliant.
And I am Vivi Henriette of Art of the Zodiac, signing off today.
There are no parents, no other adults, no one to interfere with the fun.